today. I will get to our panelists in just a quick moment, but first I have a question for everybody out there in the audience. Raise your hand if you do not live in a city. Oh, wow, that's a higher percentage than I expected. Well, then we have a lot to learn here from the two mayors, or the two officials here today. In turn, cities account for 75% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which is why, in the face of inaction at the federal level here in America, and perhaps even at the global level, people leading at the cities are really important to this debate. So here today I have to my immediate left, Dan Zarelli. He's the Chief Climate Policy Advisor and one NYC Director of the City of New York under Mayor Bill de Blasio, who you may also know as a presidential candidate. He also worked under former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who opted not to run for president, but instead is throwing $500 million into fighting fossil fuels. So Dan has a lot of perspectives on both of those topics. And then to his left, we have Mayor Sam Liccardo, mayor since 2015 of San Jose, which, according to his Twitter profile, is the 10th largest city, but the first coolest city. But I don't know, this is my first time in Aspen, and it's pretty cool.
It's not bad here.
Also, one time I was driving in San Jose and I got stuck in a roundabout and I couldn't get out. So that's my main memory of that city. So hopefully you create new memories for me.
Working on it.
So cities are such an integral part, given the fact that most people live in cities, except for perhaps this room. And of course, that's where the emissions are. But, you know, there's a lot of skepticism about what cities can do. Just earlier this week, in fact, I was in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based, and Bill Gates was in town. And many of you may know Mr. Gates as a big climate change investor after his Microsoft years. And he was like, cities can't do anything, and this needs to be at the global level. So do you guys think that Bill Gates is wrong, and why? I'll start with you, Mayor.
Yeah, I think that there's an enormous opportunity for local governments and local communities to step up, and in part because it's the cities, the counties, the local communities that control land use decisions, control building codes, address transit investment, transportation in so many ways. You think about all the ways we affect, for example, utilities are often publicly owned. If not, then the cities are the largest customer of those utilities and have an enormous amount of influence about how those utilities operate. So there's no question we could do better with real leadership in Washington on this issue, but there's an enormous amount of opportunity for local governments.
I think that's absolutely right.
So Bill Gates is not wrong.
There is, it's important that we understand the sort of the dynamic here, and it's, in the last decade of climate action, cities have definitely been doing a ton of work. Lots of others have been doing a ton of work. We all need to work on getting our greenhouse gas emissions down and going after the source of pollution and ending our reliance on fossil fuels. But in the last 2.5 years in particular, it's really shown a spotlight on the necessity of the federal government. And we can do a ton. And there was a bit of a silver lining, I think, in some ways on the president announcing the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, because it did make a bunch more of us say, we have to do more. And so we've all been accelerating our own actions. But it won't be enough. We need an active federal government that is working to support the actions that are happening in cities, in states, businesses, universities, the whole landscape. And cities, I think, are a really important nexus because that's where the economic activity is, that's where the people are. But we can't let that turn into, don't worry, federal government, we got it. Because they're rolling back the actions that are necessary, and we need their support to be able to go even further.
And I certainly agree with that. I just think that we spend an enormous amount of our energy on resisting whatever's happening in D.C. And I'm convinced, as you look at leadership that's coming out of New York and a lot of cities, San Jose and others, there's an enormous amount of that energy could be well directed toward making progress locally.
So I'm going to continue this conversation for about another half an hour, but then I will be throwing it out to you in the audience for questions. So please be thinking about that. And also joining in on the conversation, #AspenIdeas. I would be doing that too if I could be tweeting and moderating at the same time. But both San Jose and New York City have put forth aggressive climate policies in the last couple of months and years. So let's talk about those, just the high points of those. Mayor Liccardo, you announced much of your plan in February 2018. What are the high points of that, and how are you doing so far?
So we're working hard to ensure we are Paris aligned in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we know that's not enough, so we've got to do more than that. And along with New York, we were one of the first half dozen cities to come out with a clear climate plan that could do that. What we're really focused on primarily is first doing everything we can to green the grid. And with the launch of community choice energy in San Jose, we became the largest city in the country to do this, essentially giving residents and businesses the ability to choose the source of their electricity and choose sources that have much higher renewable sources in percentage terms, and also lower cost than the incumbent investor-owned utility. And that has dramatically improved our profile in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So while we're doing that, and our goal is by 2021 we'll be 100% GHG free on all of our electricity supply. We're now at about 80% GHG free. So as we're doing that, then the next step obviously is trying to electrify everything else. And that means buildings, building codes, try to electrify what has been predominantly gas operated for decades, if not centuries. And then obviously transportation infrastructure, everything from electric charging infrastructure for vehicles, electrifying train systems that are 150 years old that should have been electrified decades ago, getting electric buses out there on the street. We've had the largest deployment of electric buses of any airport in the country. So we're going to continue to push on all those initiatives. We'd expect to enact something on the building code side in August that will be effective in 2020 that would require all new residential construction to be electric and zero net energy. And we're trying to do that across most of commercial forms. Probably won't be able to affect industrial, but again, zero net energy commercial buildings as well. Adobe just broke ground on their, I think, the first major office zero net energy all electric.
So Dan, the heart of the Green New Deal that the New York City recently launched, a big part of that, the emissions are coming from building retrofits. Can you talk about that plan? And also, I'm sure many of you saw in the headlines the big Green New Deal bill that New York State has passed. So it seems like whatever level of government in New York, you guys certainly are taking a lot of action. So what are the high points of the city's Green New Deal? And can you talk about the impacts on the building part in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So the New York City put forward a plan called 1NYC, which is our Green New Deal, and it's meant to, one, aim for the truth here, that we face a climate emergency and we need to confront this climate crisis, and how we get there matters as well, achieving equity and strengthening our democracy so that we can actually come together to solve these challenges. A lot of the core greenhouse gas emission pieces of this is really anchored in that buildings retrofit program. We put out and worked with our city council, we passed really world-leading legislation to require existing buildings to retrofit to meet very high energy efficiency standards with targets in 2024 and 2030, so 40% reduction and then 80% reduction ultimately by 2050. So this is, greenhouse gas emissions are 70%, buildings account for 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions, transportation is about another 25%. And so going after the buildings first and foremost was really important to us. And there's a number of other pieces of this, but I think that what the mayor said before around electrification, and we don't always talk about it in these terms of we need to stop burning stuff for our energy, and we need to make sure we're electrifying everything, and that means getting more clean electricity into the grid and refitting our grids to be able to handle different peak loads and different time of day uses that come from trying to electrify things like heat and hot water loads, which is really, I think, some of the challenging aspects of the buildings legislation. But there's a whole lot more to what we've put out as well, and it's about expanding to full mandatory citywide organic composting. We are committing to full 100% clean electricity for municipal uses in the next 5 years for the full city by 2040. We're doing it while we're also preparing a city with 520 miles of coastline for greater impacts from climate change, flooding, heat, really pulling all of this together into getting our greenhouse gas emissions down, stop being part of the problem, preparing for the effects that we've already locked in, and taking the fight really straight to the fossil fuel company that's caused this with our divestment and lawsuit action. So we see it as a comprehensive program that really is pushing forward and bringing the equity components into it so that all New Yorkers ultimately are a part of this journey. Thank you.
So on the divestment front, that is one very concrete way that cities can have an impact, because New York City has recently taken money from its pension out of fossil fuel companies. Is that something, Mayor Liccardo, that you would consider doing in San Jose? And can you talk about kind of what concerns you might have in terms of evaluating that type of move?
Yeah, actually, Dan and I were just talking about this backstage, and we are very interested in this. The challenge I think a lot of cities have is we don't necessarily control investment decisions made by the pension boards. Those are typically independent legally. And so we're trying to understand what we can do and what we can't do as policymakers. And I think also what was critically important for me to understand better, and Dan really explained very well backstage, is we want to make sure there's a clear line, understanding in advance who it is we're investing in and who we're not investing in. And I think clearly focusing on those companies that have stored energy in the ground is a very clear, bright line. This is exactly what we need. The challenge becomes if you start to broaden that into a whole host of other considerations that would probably envelop every company on the planet, and then it becomes very difficult just to get the work done.
So one big concern that people have are the impact of aggressive climate policies on lower income people. And so first I want to pose a question to you, Mayor Liccardo, and then we'll go to you, Dan. So there's actually a lawsuit pending against the state of California alleging that the very aggressive climate policies of that state are exacerbating the housing crisis in California and therefore discriminating against lower income and minority people. It's been filed by the 200, which is a civil rights group. And that lawsuit is ongoing, and I don't ask you to comment specifically on that lawsuit because you're not involved, but can you talk about what concerns you have about what are incredibly important measures, but how you can ensure that they don't impact disproportionately lower income people?
Yeah, and I think maybe saying it more positively, we should ensure that everyone can benefit from the green dividend. And we know that right now, far too many of our residents, particularly in low-income communities, believe that being green is just for people who can afford Teslas. And that's something we absolutely have to change. As we launched the San Jose Clean Energy Initiative, where essentially we're taking over the role of the investor-owned utilities in producing energy, we're able to generate revenues that previously went to shareholders and to executives at those companies, and we are reinvesting those revenues in energy-efficient retrofits in multifamily housing, particularly rent-restricted affordable housing, to try to ensure that the green dividend reaches everybody in the community. And that is going to be so critical for us moving forward because we have to show everyone in the community that this is good for all of us in the short run and in the long term. It's not good enough to tell a single mom with 2 kids who's working 3 jobs, hey, you're going to just have to pay more for a while because we're trying to save the planet. We've got to be able to make it work for everybody.
Dan, I want to go to you, and some of what I've read about the city's plan goes back to the building retrofit requirements. Can you talk about what you're doing to mitigate any negative impacts it could have?
Yeah, so what was, as we were going down the road for our mandatory building retrofits, it became clear that there needed to be a different set of solutions for different kind of buildings. And we have a pretty robust rent regulation, rent stabilization regime in New York. But one sort of flaw in that system is that landlords, until recently, could pass on the costs of investments into the property back onto the tenants. And maybe there's a lot of cases where that makes sense. But in the case of energy efficiency upgrades, there actually is a cost saving that's accruing to a building owner. But they were able to essentially double dip. They were able to turn around and pass that back onto the tenants, even if they were keeping the cost savings. So as we were working with through the state city council and ultimately the state legislature on this, the focus on affordable housing and making sure that we weren't doing these retrofits in a way that hurt and raised rents and hurt tenants was a driving factor for us. It wasn't something we were, it wasn't an afterthought in this process. It was core to how do we get the retrofits done that are keeping us aligned with the Paris Agreement and still protect tenants and New Yorkers who, are also facing rising unaffordability in our housing stock and all sorts of other challenges economically. And pulling those things together, it ended up being wildly successful as we passed through the city council, protecting the affordable housing stock, and then as the rent regulations were renewed in the state, working to revise those pass-through costs onto tenants, and we got to a much stronger place for our tenants, and we have really strong energy efficiency guidelines now.
So cutting emissions from the electricity sector is relatively easy compared to the transportation or industrial sectors, as we've talked about. A quick question for the audience and the panelists. Raise your hand if you drive an electric car. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't own a car. And raise your hand if you drive a gasoline-powered car. Okay, so gas is still king, even here in Aspen.
I'll give a caveat. I have a plug-in hybrid. So.
Oh, right. That was like the other category. Yeah. I like to ask that question because it drives home. We were sitting here talking about kind of an intangible topic of climate change, and yet we use energy every day. And so I think it's important to understand that as you're trying to make these greener. So Mayor LaCarter, how are you trying to convince very car-obsessed California city to either buy electric cars, maybe not a Tesla, but or to use public transit more?
So actually really important to point out the distinction. As you said, car-obsessed California. Dan described New York as having the GHG profile there, which I think you have the best profile of any city in the country. 70% of your GHG emissions are from buildings. And 20-something% from transportation. It's flipped. In a city like San Jose, 62% of emissions are coming from transportation. And that's the way it is, Phoenix, LA, basically Western United States. So that is the real challenge for us, is around transportation. So part of it is around electrifying transit that we are currently using that is not electrified, believe it or not. In the heart of Silicon Valley, we have a system, Caltrain, that was built during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, still using the same technology to drive the train. So we're now underway on an electrification project that costs $2 billion, which it always costs too much, but boy, do we need it. So we need to do more, obviously, on all of our systems. We're investing billions of dollars in new transit in San Jose, connecting us with the other large cities in the Bay Area with a system called BART. That's an $8 billion investment. It's under construction now. It'll be open. Part of it will be open in a few months. We are going to be the first major city in the country with a high-speed rail system as well. And we hope, if all goes well in the next few years. So there's a lot of investment that requires, frankly, a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of residents who are willing to cough up the dollars to get there. But I think we all know the reality is folks are still going to be chained to their steering wheels no matter how well we do in building out this infrastructure, partly because land uses need to align with transportation infrastructure, and that requires a lot of retrofitting in cities like San Jose. We're eliminating all the building height restrictions. We're converting single-family parcels anywhere near transit to allow more densification. You just have to do that if you're going to actually get people on transit. And then obviously with the cars themselves, it's around building the EV infrastructure and mandating it in new building construction, as we're doing starting in 2020, so that residential, particularly multifamily, as well as commercial, will have that EV infrastructure in place, which is much less expensive than retrofitting, which can cost 6 times as much. I know we've got to retrofit because it's the only path forward, but it's so much easier if we can just mandate it up front. Fortunately, St. Clair County, where San Jose is the largest adoption of electric vehicles anywhere in the country. As you might expect, Silicon Valley will have a lot of folks who are quite willing to pioneer. But what we're seeing is that it's working even in a very commute-heavy region where folks have to drive a long ways. If you get the infrastructure in place, people enjoy it, they benefit, and they'll sell cars.
Dan, the mayor recently.
Can I add to that? Because I think it's a really important point that we in city government and with policy need to do everything we can to make it easier on this transition. And there's market incentives, and there's mandatory codes, and there's how we build and how we do land use. Those are so critically important, and yet we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back because let's consider things like fossil fuel subsidies. I think the IMF recently reported that the U.S. spends something like $650 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. So we're trying to set up incentives so people can make easier choices, and yet we are. The fight is not nearly fair because we're always facing unnaturally cheap natural gas and fossil fuel products. We have to be able to take on the political power of the fossil fuel industry to help make these choices even easier. And it's not just, are you willing to spend a little bit more money, but it's something we can actually share with and bring the benefits, like you say, to all of our residents. It's a really important point because we are constantly pushing a boulder uphill given the current landscape on fossil fuels.
Yeah, you raise a good point, because there's the bucket of things that cities can do from a logistical perspective, but then there's sort of, this decision whether or not to get into the politics of things. And obviously New York has in many ways. The mayor is running for president. Mayor Liccardo, is that something that you think you would, not running for president necessarily.
I'm officially announcing I'm not going to be a candidate this year. My wife says she'd divorce me if I did.
What about you, Dan? Are you going to run against your boss? Okay. And I'm not either, so we got that out of the way. But Mayor Liccardo, have you thought about whether or not you should somehow become more politicized as a mayor? From what I understand, you're not quite as active as New York.
Yeah, we're not. But look, we're in California. We've sued the administration a half dozen times already. Along with all the other cities, we immediately jumped on the signatories of the Paris Accord when Trump backed out, saying we're in. We'll continue to do that. And I absolutely do think there's value, particularly when cities gather together to take legal action and political action against the administration. I wasn't suggesting, there shouldn't be that kind of response. We absolutely need it. But we also recognize that moving the needle in, frankly, for example, a Senate that is still controlled by the president's party and an administration that is just not interested in lifting their hands in any way to do anything. Look, we've got a lot to do in order to take over in 2020. But in the meantime, I think our best energy is focused on showing how we can demonstrate to the rest of the country and the rest of the world how New York, San Jose, and other cities throughout the country can lead on this issue.
I want to ask you a couple of questions about places other than San Jose and New York. So a quick lightning round, which is that I ask you to keep your answer to 1 or 2 words, no longer. I know that's very hard in a place like Aspen Ideas Festival where everybody is talking, but we can delve into it after the quick answer. So if you can name one city around the world that you admire with what they're doing on climate change or that you've gleaned some lessons, what city would that be?
Georgetown, Texas.
Oslo.
Great. Now that you followed the rules, yes, you can say why.
Okay, I actually deliberately picked a city with a red mayor, not Republican mayor, forgive me, a red city with a Republican mayor, because they announced a couple years ago they wanted to make their electric source 100% GHG free, and they're doing it. And they're doing it by demonstrating that there's cost savings, obviously, and the benefits to all the residents, which is to say we should be able, I hope, with enough hard work to be able to demonstrate to folks that there are lots of attendant benefits in choosing a path that is good for the planet. And we have to do that because we can't simply bring along the folks who think like we do. We have to be able to bring along folks who think differently.
So I mentioned Oslo because I had been there recently and interacted as part of some work through our C40 cities. And
C40 is?
C40 Climate Leadership Group, a group of not 40 cities, ironically. It's about 90 cities now.
They should maybe rename it.
I'll bring it up. But the things that they've done there on public transit and making their city car-free and being able to pull parking out from their city core and, being a city that is pushing the limits on sort of car-free technology, electrification, electrifying their ports and their ferries, and in a country that has made a ton of money off of oil, but is now also pushing in the direction of divesting and getting their money out of exploration. I think it's inspiring to be able to see that. And of course, the Nordics are a little different, and there's lots of things that happen there that are a little bit more difficult than here. But some of the decisions they've been able to make are just inspiring.
This raises a couple of good questions that I want to come back to. On the Norway part, I was actually in Oslo last year, and I visited a waste-to-energy facility, which is basically where you take all of our garbage, which is, of course, an increasing problem as we don't recycle plastics and they end up in landfills. And this garbage goes into this incinerator and is burned for electricity. And it's a controversial way to generate electricity because without tough emission controls, they're very polluting. But Oslo does do waste to energy, and they want to try to put technology on there to make it far less polluting. Is that something that, and also waste to energy is something that cities have direct control over because you control the garbage. Is this something that is a solution in your cities? And why or why not?
Yes, for us, we have the largest anaerobic digestion plant in the country, which is
We should do tours there. That sounds exciting.
Yeah, it's smelly, but it's exciting.
Field trip for the next Ideas Festival.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll bring a little of the trash here. So that I am told, as I understand it, the residual components are much less damaging to the environment through anaerobic than aerobic digestion. We're also experimenting with an interesting company that's piloting. We pilot with lots of interesting Silicon Valley companies. They're doing all kinds of things. Bioselection is one you ought to keep in mind. They're actually figuring out a way to, through chemical processes, to recycle what we thought was unrecyclable plastic. And so far, at least at the pilot level, they're showing real success. Again, we need to understand better what are all the byproducts, but I think we've got a path.
Dan, you were shaking your head.
Well, on the anaerobic digestion, with our organic composting, we are generating basically like a biomethane that we feed back into the grid, and that's been a really successful program with our wastewater treatment plants. Waste to energy, like, hey, let's take all of our garbage and plastics and burn them for electricity, not going to happen in New York City. What worries me about that kind of technology is it reinforces the sort of out of sight, out of mind of our sort of consumption, culture that we have. And too much plastics, too much waste. And you mentioned this before. New York City, by most definitions of greenhouse gas emissions, we have about a third of the average GHGs per capita of the United States. But when you toss in the consumption pieces of it, New York City is probably by far the worst because we fly more, we consume more. So it worries me that's like, let's find ways to get rid of more plastic by burning it and generating electricity when we should be going at the root source of getting rid of our plastics. The mayor signed an executive order that New York City is banning unnecessary single-use plastic foodware. We're working with the city council to extend that to all food service in the city. We're going to be signing an executive order that we're going to be cutting our beef purchases in half, phasing out processed meat. So we're trying to get into the consumption part of this equation as well, because it's just as important. And I just don't see that we can sort of burn our way out of what is a growing problem, especially as the world recycling markets are drying up and really getting unfavorable.
Yeah, let me say, I'm not sure we disagree. Yeah. Because
but it's okay if you do.
Yeah, it's okay if we do. I mean, we banned plastic footwear years ago. We're going to do everything we can to try to take this waste out of the stream, and nobody wants to burn. I think that is not a process that is likely to be ever good, but we have to embrace some kind of innovation because we're simply not going to dig our way out of this hole with the existing technologies. And I think, Dan, you absolutely described what is today. There's no question it's not a good path, but what could be if we're able to engage innovation in a meaningful way, I think could be very promising.
So Mayor Liccardo, I want to go back to what you said about the city you picked, Georgetown, Texas. So we have here two, prominent coastal leaders, but this is a very big country, and in fact, most of the emissions are in states that aren't, most of the fossil fuel emissions anyway are in other states. Can you talk about to what degree you try to engage mayors in other states that are a bit redder than your states? And or alternatively, can you talk about maybe some of the challenges that you might have trying to engage? I imagine, unfortunately, our world is becoming more polarized, and I just wonder if that's also happening at the city level, or mayors are supposed to be more pragmatic, and so hopefully some of the politics don't occur. Can you talk about that type of outreach, if it exists, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think, among mayors, the organization probably engaged with most is U.S. Mayors Conference, and it is true that I think you see a lot less of the kind of behavior you tend to see in other political forums. I co-chair climate change committee with a Republican, Jim Brainers from Carmel, Indiana. Clearly, there are Republicans, such as my colleague Kevin Faulkner down in San Diego, who are embracing very progressive approaches to everything from development to transit to all the climate change issues we care about. So I think this is something that can cross the boundary. We just need, frankly, more leadership, and that's more leadership on both sides. It is very easy for us, those of us who consider ourselves Democrats, to paint the other side with one brush and put them in a corner. And to the extent that we can encourage and embolden folks on both sides to step out of their corners, I think we'll make some progress.
Dan, do you engage with a lot of Republican offices around the country?
I mean, to be clear, I think you probably named some of the, maybe two of the, not many more than two Republican mayors that are that are out there in cities, especially like in big cities. It's largely dominated by
It's a
Democrats.
Democratic club mostly, yeah.
Mostly, and so I think the answer is generally no. I think we would talk to the big cities across the country, and it ends up being mostly left-leaning, progressive, or Democrats. But part of me thinks that it's almost the wrong way to split this, and I'll keep coming back to sort of fossil fuel challenges, because what we've seen over the last decade is, any Republican who's willing to stand up and say, climate change is real and we're going to take action on it is fearing a primary that's going to be funded by fossil fuel money, and I think that it's more about that than it is about a partisan divide. It's about the money that is driving the partisan divide. So I think it's important to just recognize that landscape, at least here in the United States.
I want to ask one more question before I throw it out to you in the audience, so please be thinking of questions. So we've been talking mostly about mitigating climate change, and many of you, since you're here, you probably know that there's basically two ledgers to the climate change debate. One is mitigating it, so reducing emissions, and the other one is adapting to a warmer world, which is already here, and it's going to continue to come and grow more intense, even if we did somehow magically stop emitting tomorrow. And I think cities, even more here than on the mitigation side, cities are really on the forefront of that. Of the challenge of adapting to climate change. And Dan, you've really been at the forefront of that under Mayor Bloomberg and Hurricane Sandy. Can you talk about sort of, what can be done there, separate from the mitigation side of the equation?
Well, so we know that the world's already changed. In New York Harbor, our seas have risen almost a foot since 1900. We know it's hotter. We know it's raining more. So I think we came to the realization pretty quickly after Hurricane Sandy that this climate change is not something that's happening to someone else far away. It's here and it's now, and we need to do something about it. The moment of Hurricane Sandy for us, it really, in a lot of ways, it shook us to consciousness on the issues of climate change. Helpfully, it also unleashed a flow of federal money that helped us. So we had been doing a lot of planning in the years before Hurricane Sandy hit on what our climate vulnerabilities are and how we might adapt to them, or how we might begin to push those forward. We are spending over $20 billion right now on adaptation measures, resiliency measures, things like coastal protection, heat mitigation, planting more trees, adding more capacity into our drainage networks, things like that. Elevating homes in our coastal areas, elevating mechanical equipment on multifamily buildings, a whole fully comprehensive program, upgrading codes and standards and zoning, everything. It's just a reflection of the fact that we are a coastal city. We have all this risk and we have to deal with it. but the choices of how far to go are still important. And we're guided by the science on what the projections look like, but those are also dependent on how much we continue to emit. And so there are sort of two sides to this ledger, but they are very connected. And the choices we make now determine sort of how much sea level rise we see at the end of the day, how hot it's actually going to get, by the end of the century. And it's important to think of those two as very connected conversations, and not as like sort of disparate or discrete conversations in their own right.
Yeah, I agree. There's no question we need to invest heavily in both. My concern is that there's a finite amount of money, and obviously one does divert from the other inevitably in any budget. So we're certainly investing in the levees and other things that we need to do. We recognize being a city near water, we're going to have to adjust. But again, I think innovation may help. We're working right now with a developer who's trying to figure out how to build a multifamily apartment building on a foundation that will float as the water essentially comes up in a part of our city where we've got some swampy land. Obviously that's not the solution, but we're going to need a lot of solutions like that. And we're seeing it today. Ground zero is Miami, and talking to the mayor down there about just what they're dealing with water coming up the street on any day of the week, it's pretty dramatic. And the amount of investment that's required here is far greater than I think we have ever seen for infrastructure in this country, certainly since the 50s, probably ever.
I'm going to add one more point to that, because I expand on this idea that the dollars are finite, and so how you choose where to spend your money becomes really important. And it introduces this whole different level of like a global local equity dynamic, where if you have a certain dollar, you can, you might get pressure to invest to protect your residents here, or you can invest to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions that has a global benefit. And so much of the adaptation conversation is about sort of how do we protect us here, when too much of this conversation is around like the very physical things that are going to happen, the more water, the more heat. Those impacts are going to happen not just in our cities, they're going to happen globally. It's going to put people on the move. It's going to cause conflict. It's going to cause food insecurity. And those challenges are not well handled with seawalls and with drainage pumps and things like that. And so keeping it, I just want to reemphasize keeping those conversations together and recognizing the global, local equity values that you insert by making these decisions becomes really important.
Great. I would like to throw it out to the audience. We have 2 mic runners going around. So maybe the gentleman in the black shirt, right? Yep.
Hi. Concerning the measures that New York just passed on rent control and building codes, how do you balance that with perhaps reduced investment returns in private capital investment into multifamily? Without those dollars, none of those projects get built.
No, I think it is really important. We are certainly a city where real estate, drives a lot of the economy, right? It also drives a lot of our politics, which is a different dynamic to talk about. And we think there is a better balance in those equations where we are able to secure the affordable housing and get to the energy efficiency that is not going to turn the spigot off on investment in New York City. New York City is continuing to be a dynamic economy. That's not going to change. It may rebalance a little bit. It may change the equations a little bit. We'll see how that plays out. But if we're going to say, let's let the private market figure this whole thing out, then we're on a path to ruin because we're not setting the standards on what we need for energy efficiency, for reduced energy use, in line with what we need to do as a globe.
Great. We have some up here in the front. Take the woman right there in the coral shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. This is particularly for the mayor. I'm concerned that a lot of what you're doing is great, okay, and I think we need to do a lot more of it. But I'm concerned that because of our levels of desperation to change the climate situation, that it could lead to less critical thought in terms of how we deal with some things and a level of gullibility. For instance, I'm thinking particular what's happened. Your town, I'm in San Diego with Mayor Faulkner, and we've had anarchy on the streets because of the gullibility towards scooters. It's an alternative transportation mode, and a lot of people may not know about it in this room. We've got probably 50,000 this year on the streets because they've had no control at all.
And no pedestrian is safe.
No pedestrian is safe. I am with an organization I helped start called Safe Walkways, SD. The gullibility comes from the fact that they say that they are green. And yet we've done, but they have nothing to prove that. Because you have zero emissions when you drive does not mean they are zero emissions overall. One of the main factors, there's so much cars and trucks that go around, pick them up all the time, that we've done a research scientist did a study, and they are not green. We can send that to you. So there's a gullibility in terms of that, but what we have is this problem. There's an ADA problem. I have filed a complaint to the Department of Justice Disability Rights section, and they are in the process of evaluating that right now, which is going to come down. And the danger, we keep having people die. We've had another person die this week since I've been here.
And do you have a particular
Yeah, the question is, I was really looking forward. I thought you had a red line that you were going to draw, that if they couldn't get off the streets by the 1st of June, off the sidewalks by the 1st of June, you were going to kick them out of San Jose. Could you explain to me what happened?
Yeah, the line isn't quite that hard. The line we drew was, we said we wouldn't give permits to any scooter companies. And by the way, I think this is really important because micromobility is going to be really critical for us as a strategy.
Raise your hand if you've ridden a scooter. Okay, that's
Yes.
the room.
Yes, and it's bike share, it's scooters. We got to find a lot of ways to solve this first mile, last mile problem for transit, especially in California, because it ain't going to go away, given the way we've built our cities. And for scooters, look, I think they're here to stay. What we said was, if you're going to get a permit in the city of San Jose, then by July you must demonstrate that you have implemented a geofencing technology that will keep these scooters off of busy sidewalks or transit, where bus stops are, maybe where a senior home might be, where we expect a lot of residents might be more vulnerable, and demonstrate that you can do that. And then we're going to start to pilot this over several blocks of the city and expand it. So we're going to find out in a few weeks. I'm told 2 of the companies have taken us up on this, and they're ready to demonstrate in July. We'll find out if it works. But we're in Silicon Valley, and we sometimes fail, and then we fail forward and try something else, and we're going to keep pushing on this. But there's a lot of different options here to how do you get to that technology, whether it's, well, I won't bore you with the details, but my understanding is we're going to see 2 or 3 different approaches to this, and we'll find out what works in the next few weeks and hopefully scale it.
Great, and we have a lot of more questions, so maybe the gentleman in the blue?
Yes, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the agency of the United Nations, which is driving a lot of this, have announced several years ago that the cost of converting over a 15-year period would be about $96 trillion. And this past October, they've renewed that change, that the cost over a 15-year period would be $122 trillion. And given that the fact that there have been yellow jacket riots in France because of passing along the costs on the gas tax, and a change of government in Australia in the last few months, I think you got to be careful talking about a green dividend, and instead of having a massive tax increase. The costs are pretty substantial, and I think we need to be forthcoming on that.
I'm not aware that the IPCC has ever put a number out like that. That sounds like a Heartland Institute number that I've seen very recently.
Negative.
So
it came out in October. You can just go ahead and Google it.
We can definitely talk about that number offline, but do you want to answer?
Maybe I could just offer, look, whatever tax we're going to need to pass to pay for what we need to do to address climate change, it will come at a bargain compared to the cost of doing nothing.
The woman right here in the front.
To his question about the tax, what do you do to keep the middle and lower classes from having to shoulder the weight of that? Like, how do you keep the actual perpetrators of climate change accountable for their actions?
Please. We're suing them. So I think.
But how is that lawsuit going?
Right. So hold it. We'll get there in a second. The cost. Framing this around like the cost of a tax and how that hits, the cost of climate change are hitting, poor communities, communities of color. Like we're seeing that very clearly. We filed suit against Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, BP, Shell for the damages that we've seen, and it's really kind of a two-part argument. One is that we use their product exactly as intended, and it caused damage. It's a basic product liability case. And we've seen damages. We want them to pay for those damages, and whether that's seawalls or some other things, that needs to happen. The other part of this is really almost, and I'm not a lawyer, but this is almost a fraud case. They knew 30 years ago, 50 years ago, like they had the best climate science. They invested to raise the heights of their oil drilling platforms against rising sea levels, and then turned around and told us that it wasn't actually happening. So we're going after them. We got kicked out of court by the first judge. We're appealing. We'll be in front of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, I believe, later this year. But we've seen some really important decisions in a case that Baltimore has brought, a very similar case to ours. I believe it was San Mateo as well, had a favorable ruling that kept these cases in state court where they belong, and there's no federal preemption. This is not a Clean Air Act claim that we're making. This is a simple argument that their product caused damage. They should pay for the damage.
Mayor Liccardo, are you involved in any lawsuits against big oil companies?
We've been talking to some jurisdictions in the Bay Area about doing something together. Several have already done so.
What's your hesitation?
Well, what we've seen so far is most of the cases have been dismissed. And so you generally want to pick a strategy you think has a chance of winning. And so we're interested in seeing what emerges from all this. And I am confident we'll be among the many cities that will jump in as soon as someone can demonstrate there's a path. As with all litigation, it's going to take a lot of attempts, a lot of failure, and then we're going to find a way.
And the overall climate litigation space is interesting. Cities are definitely one piece of that, and whether San Francisco and Oakland and New York and a few others. But then there's the cases that state AGs are bringing for securities fraud is also a different angle. The youth cases that are being brought. There's a ground. Something will open up the cracks on this, and I think others are going to jump in.
I think we have time for one or two very quick questions. The woman in white.
Thank you so much for being here and putting this wonderful forum together. Kind of twofold. I'm wondering, where is the National League of Cities on these sort of things, which I assume you would participate in? It's been an old observation and cliche that you have blue cities and red counties. And in Colorado, we have a lot of those red fossil fuel economy counties. How do we plan to help them adapt to a new economy, to supplement what they have now? And where is the National League of Cities? Thank you.
I'm not a good source on National League. I mean, we participate, council members on my council participate. I don't participate much directly because they tend to represent more of a small town interest than, frankly, big cities that are probably more engaged with U.S. Mayor's Conference. And we form large city collaboratives that work on a lot of these issues. So there's frankly a bit of a divide ideologically among cities based on their size.
Yeah, same on National League of Cities. I think we've done a lot with U.S. Conference of Mayors and other study networks. The point, and we haven't really talked about this too much, the concept of just transition and the idea that the fossil fuel workers in these industries, by no means do we think they're the problem, right? They have jobs, they're doing the right thing for their families. We need, in all of the work that we do as cities and all of the work we do acting on climate, to make sure we put that front and center on how we're helping those workers transition to what a new economy looks like. Because I think that helps bridge the divide and gets it past the partisan divide. And it really is just about how do we build a better future together.
If somebody has one more quick question, so people with quick questions can raise their hands. The gentleman right there, yes.
For many years, the federal government offered a tax rebate for consumers to purchase electric vehicles. Under the present administration, that's gone. A lot of tax incentives for individuals is gone. It may not be gone. It's been lowered considerably.
Declining, yeah.
It's declining. My question to you is, in order to incentivize citizens to be more environmentally conscious, what can cities do and offer to the individual, which is a mass amount of people, to incentivize them to be more conscious? In the valley here, the local energy provider offers assistance for people purchasing an electric vehicle. They will provide the electric source at your home, which is quite expensive, to charge the cars.
I think that's a good concluding question. If you guys want to just quickly sum up recommendations you have for what you guys can do to help citizens.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're right that there are declining subsidies that are happening. And, I think in a rational world, those subsidies shouldn't have to exist forever. But there's too many other forces at work that need to keep those subsidies in place. States and cities step up often to help supplement that. I can speak for New York, where if you buy an electric vehicle, you get an extra, on top of the federal, you can get an extra tax credit for the installation of the charging infrastructure, for the car itself, or the vehicle itself. It's the same with solar. We have property tax exemptions in New York City for solar installations. There are state tax exemptions and tax credits on top of the federal. So I think there's layers of things that can happen at different levels of government to continue to incentivize the right behavior to get to the right outcome.
Mayor Carter with the final word.
Yeah, since we just launched our municipal energy provider this year, we're building up reserves. The plan is starting next year, we'll be able to start to offer some of those incentives with the revenues from the energy. But the reality, and this is really to prove Dan's point against the point I made earlier, there's no amount of local incentives. Most cities are broke. And there's no amount of local incentives that are going to overcome a rollback of fuel efficiency standards at the federal level, for example. So there's no question the largest incentives, most impactful ones are going to be with the large national government. And we just have to do everything we can to get good policies in place. And hopefully with some change in the federal government, we'll be in a good position to really drive forward.
Well, it sounds like that's a good reason to tune into tonight's debates for the second night in a row. I want to say thank you to our panelists and the audience for this great conversation.